Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is IFPP's second discussion under its speaker series, which is a panel discussion on Trump 2.0 and their impact on US India relations. Today, we are going to be discussing the Trump administration's second presidency, which introduces new opportunities for recalibration, but also comes with uncertainties, especially with an increasingly volatile global order. Today's discussion, which is a 60-minute panel discussion, we have three experts on foreign policy who will explore the predicted trajectory of India-US relations, and particularly on the themes of trade, defense, climate, and immigration. So our panelists for today are Ambassador Nirupama Rao, who is the former Foreign Secretary of India and the former ambassador to the US. Ambassador Rao is also a distinguished diplomat, and she has also served in China, in Sri Lanka as well. She was the first female spokesperson for the Indian Foreign Office. Her acclaimed book, The Fractured Himalaya, India, Tibet, China, 1949 to 1962, is a key work on India-China relations. She is a recipient of accolades including the KPS Menon Memorial Award and Rotary International Citizen Extraordinaire Award. Currently, she's a Global Policy Fellow at the Wilson Center and serves on the boards of ICR-IER, the International Crisis Group, and the US-India Business Council. Thank you so much for being here, Ambassador.
Here.
Our second panelist for today is Professor Dr. Sreeram Chaulia. He is the Dean of Jindal School of International Affairs and Director General of the Jindal India Institute of OP Jindal Global University, Sonipat. He's leading opinion columnist for Dainik Jagran, which is in Hindi, and Hindustan Times, which is in English, on world affairs, and a commentator on international current issues on radio and television. He anchors the Indian Diplomacy TV show on India's national broadcaster, Doordarshan. He's a contributing editor for People Who Influence the World, Murray Books, 2005, and has authored International Organizations and Civilian Protection, Power, Ideas, and Humanitarian Aid in Conflict Zones. Politics of the Global Economic Crisis, Regulation, Responsibility to Radicalism in 2013, and Modi Doctrine, the Foreign Policy of India's Prime Minister. He has also written two more huge books, and his latest book is Friends, India's Closest Strategic Partners, which has just been published in 2024. And I think I remember Dr. Jaishankar having a panel discussion on the same when his book opened. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Chaulia.
Thank you. Great work at IFPP.
We move on to the third panelist, who is Dr. Monish Tourangbam. He is the director of the Kalinga Institute of Indo-Pacific Studies. Formerly, he was an associate professor at the Amity Institute of International Studies at Amity University, Noida, and the senior assistant professor at the Department of Geopolitics and IR at Manipal Academy of Higher Education. He was also an associate fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi and the associate editor of the Indian Foreign Affairs Journal of the Association of Indian Diplomats. He was a visiting faculty at the University of Cincinnati, Ohio, and a SAV visiting fellow at the Stimson Center, Washington, D.C. He has been part of various Track 2 dialogues. He was an international observer of the Russian presidential elections in 2018 and an Indian delegate at BRICS Exchange Program in 2017, Beijing. He delivers lectures on diplomacy at the Indian Society of International Law in New Delhi. He has written for the Institute of South Asian Studies, Stimson Center, The Diplomat, Institute of Security and Development Policy, Asian Confluence, The Print, Financial Express, India Times, and many others. He holds an MPhil and PhD in American Studies from the School of International Studies in JNU. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Tourangbam.
Thank you.
All of your bios are so huge, we hope to at least cover half of that in our lifetimes. We shall quickly start with introduction of us. I am Ajitesh Vishwanath, the founder and the chair of the Indian Foreign Policy Project. I have with me Manini Agarwal, who is co-heading the Research and Publications Division. We both will be co-moderating today's discussion. Since we are in a posit of time, we'll skip opening remarks and go directly to questions. The question framework is we'll ask either individually to all of you, or we'll pose the question to the entire panel. And we can also have follow-up questions if something interesting comes up. We'll start off with the most interesting part of Trump's second presidency, which India has to look out for, is trade and economic policies. So far, Trump's policies have been very isolationist, and he has already announced that he will impose a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada and an additional 10% on China. He has also called India a tariff abuser, but hasn't announced any tariffs for India so far. Dr. Tourangbam, my first question is to you. How likely is he to go through with his tariff plan?
See, I mean, all that we have is the first presidency to look from in terms of really making a conjecture of what the next 4 years is going to be. And, starting from January 20, things are going to develop very fast. So um, there seems to be a calm confidence in New Delhi as far as the comments that have come out from the Indian government that the economic relationship will continue without much of disruptions. Right? The projections are positive right now. Our India still has a surplus in trade with the United States. Of course, there are issues of nuts and bolts that we have to navigate. My concern, or let's just say, the issue that I want to bring it up here is rather on the multilateral front. And I would put it this way that India might not be in the direct firing line of Trump 2.0, but India has to still brace up to dose the stray bullets, so the collateral damage, so to say. And it's about how he has promised that he's going to walk out from the Indo-Pacific economic framework, which is sort of the successor to the one that we walk out from earlier, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I think if you just go through the four pillars of the IPEF, it's very clear that India is still hesitant about, jumping directly into the trade pillar, although we have been very much part of the other three pillars. And I think this impinges upon also on the climate question also, which I think we can discuss later, because if the Trump administration was going to follow through in its promise and walk out from retrench itself from some of this multilateral economic framework. India is not a part of the RCEP. IPEF is the one that India is partnering with the United States. So what we need to think through that, what are going to be the direct impact and also the unintended consequences of Trump's economic policy. We have to brace up for that. So I'll put it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that answer. But I have another question for Ambassador Rao. We, in the spirit of building new trade partnerships and counterbalancing these possible measures that Trump might take in the context of trade, how can India build, what can India mobilize to build and solidify its trade relations with the US? Perhaps, how do you think organizations like BRICS play a part?
Thank you. I'd like to say a few words about the personality that we are dealing with in the person of Donald Trump. And in this case, personality makes policy and provides the perspective about this leader. He's been variously described as transactional, as you know, but he's not competitive. That's what people say. He's not competitive, but he's transactional. And he's looking for challenges. He's not he's not one to provide corrective action. He is waiting for others to provide the corrective action. Now, I'm reminded of what the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel says in her autobiography, her memoir, that Trump does not believe in negotiations or in a win-win situation. In his mind, there is winners and losers only. So this is the kind of cartography that we are dealing with as far as Mr. Trump is concerned. Professor Monish mentioned that the mood in Delhi is quite, what shall I say, in various terms, accepting, a little laid back, quite calm about the re-advent of Donald Trump. I suppose we are going by the experience that we had in Trump 1.0 and the good chemistry and understanding between our Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, and Mr. Trump. And Mr. Trump has only a few foreign leaders with whom he expresses that kind of, what shall I say, closeness and empathy. So the late Mr. Shinzo Abe was one of them, and Mr. Modi is a leader with whom he seems to have related well in the past. So that for us is an asset. But having said that, with Mr. Trump and his being so quixotic and disinhibited and disruptive, we really don't know what to expect. He is going to, I think one of his first priorities from day one, of course, he says he'll end the Russia-Ukraine war in a day. We'll have to see how that proceeds and how long that day will be. But he is also, very fixated on immigration. I think it's a very, very hard-line stance he takes on immigration. And the people he's put in charge in his, cabinet that he's already chosen are all hawkish on immigration. And this includes legal immigration, the H1B2 visas. The entry of skilled personnel into the United States is not going to be as easy as we presumed it would be. But although technology is a very important binding factor between India and the United States today. Of course, illegal immigration is another thing, and one can expect a lot of action on deportation of illegal immigrants. How he's going to handle the millions involved, we don't know. But he'll probably start with people who are known to have criminal records and who've broken the law, and there will be a mass deportation of these people. Coming to trade, he, of course, has turned his sights on Mexico, Canada, and China for the moment. India has not been mentioned. But India is one of those countries with a favorable balance of trade with the United States, which makes us, a possible target for Mr. Trump, because he sees everything in terms of tariffs, and he sees tariffs as this magic talisman which can somehow restore balance for America in the world and be part of this whole venture of making America great again. So what it does for our trade with the United States, we'll have to see. But, I believe that he uses tariffs in the case of India, he'll probably use it as some kind of a bargaining chip. We'll have to see. I don't think he is venting aggression against India on this front, on the issue of tariffs. What should India do on trade? I think we're already, negotiating these bilateral trade deals. The WTO is almost dead in water today. I don't believe given the US stance on multilateralism and something that Mr. Trump started with his opposition to the WHO and during COVID and other, multilateral organizations, and including the WTO. And the appellate authority in WTO has not been functioning for some time now. So WTO has been reduced very much to an ineffective mechanism. And therefore, multilateral trade and global free trade as we knew it in the era of globalization, I think is something that is a chapter that perhaps has been closed, unfortunately. And people are looking, and you're looking at a world of minilaterals and plurilaterals and bilaterals. And that, in a sense, applies to trade also. Within BRICS, looking at BRICS, BRICS is expanding. There is a list of countries waiting to join. So obviously there is some cachet to being a part of BRICS. To what extent BRICS can provide a feasible balancer as far as what the United States is doing now and the dominance of the United States, which continues, let me say, to be a factor we have to deal with. The United States is still a very dominant power, still seeks to be the hegemon, and it has the military and economic and political weight to exert that kind of presence across the world. Whether that is happening in Asia and the Indo-Pacific, we'll have to see, because Mr. Trump's attitude to alliances and partnerships being what it is, how he is going to treat South Korea, for instance. Somebody was saying, I heard yesterday that he has an animus against South Korea because of a failed business deal in the past when he was a New York businessman. So he carries these feelings far beyond, the phase in which an event may have actually happened. So in the Indo-Pacific, will the US Will US under Trump, for instance, promote the Quad, like Mr. Biden brought it to the summit level? Of course, the Quad is not a military or strategic alliance. It's not an Asian NATO. AUKUS, of course, has a very strong security element to it, but India is not a part of it. The way we define the Indo-Pacific, many of us in the Indo-Pacific, is very different. India sees it as stretching to the east coast of Africa. And that's not the way our East Asian friends look at it. For instance, the Japanese don't, I'm sure, look at it that way. So our preoccupations with China, our preoccupations not only on the border and on the national security front, but also on trade and all the non-tariff barriers that we face as far as the export of our goods to China are concerned. All these are going to be points that will occupy a lot of our attention now that the disengagement has happened in Tepsang and Demchok, the last 2 points along the line of actual control, where the confrontation had continued. We'll have to see to what extent this leads to a reopening up of at least those areas where our businesses can benefit from that linkage with China. Although even there the jury is out. There are many areas where the government feels that national security should predominate, as I believe it should, on the trade front, given the fractured world that we live in.
That was incredibly well put. Thank you so much, Ambassador. And I think there's a lot we have to unpack about immigration and Trump's nominations, which later on in the discussion. The next question we have is for Professor Chaulia. While we are talking about Trump's hawkish nature and his zero-sum mindset, what would greater US tariffs look like for the average Indian? What does it mean for price hikes, say, in sectors like technology, pharmaceuticals, agriculture?
See, if you look at the estimates of economists, 25% tariffs on Mexico, for example, could bring about an economic recession there. Why? Because 75% or 3/4 of their exports and trade is with the US, as part of NAFTA and now the USMCA, as it's called. Our dependence on the US as a whole, as an economy, on trade with the US is not that high. We are still a domestic consumption driven economy. Trade as a percentage of GDP is growing, and our exports have risen to record levels in the last few years. But that's not exclusive to the US. So although we have 200 billion plus trade with the US, there are others who also buy Indian products. So we will look for diversification of markets, and that's always been the case. And I don't think it is going to cause a recession in our case, or shave off several percentage points of India's GDP growth. I'm not looking at it that way. Even the first Trump administration, steel and aluminum tariffs and all of those, it is, in spite of that, the overall bilateral trade continued to grow. And that's because it's not only about Trump or about the administration. These are like decisions being taken by individual corporate players and business partners on both sides, right? So there is still value to be gained in mutual exchange, and we will continue to extract it. There will be tariffs. There's no doubt that Trump will impose tariffs. The question is how much of a dent it will make. So I don't think that it will really affect average consumers in the country. There may be certain sectors. For example, information technology enabled services and such things, which are very closely and tightly linked to the US economy. So those ones you might find some fluctuations, but it's not the case that it will slow down or cause a deceleration in our currently very high GDP growth of 7 to 8%. So I don't think the trade war with India is going to be so severe, partly because for strategic reasons, there will be people advising Trump that we have to go light on India because it's the counterweight to China, even though he may not believe in counterbalancing China in a as part of his grand strategy, there will be people weighing in on that aspect. There'll be people saying it's a democracy. There'll be people saying Modi is a nice guy. We need to get along with him. All these things. And then on the other hand, it's also the surplus that India enjoys with the US is not that massive. Historically, Trump targets the countries with whom the US has huge deficits. China, of course, number one. Germany, Japan. He goes after allies and partners which have massive, trade surpluses with the US. India's trade surplus has never crossed, if I'm not wrong, never even crossed 50-60 billion dollars. So it will not be, I think, bullseye for him to target. It will be somewhere out there in that spiral of the targets. So I think we can weather the storm, and I don't think it will in any way downgrade the Indian economy or hurt the average Indian consumer or producer that much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chaulia. Given that we have discussed China in a lot of varied manners. I just have a personal question regarding Elon Musk's relationship to Trump. Since Elon Musk has a lot of investments in China, and the close relationship with Trump himself, would he have an impact at all on Trump's policies towards China? I open this up to any panelist.
Can I come in?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Well, I heard that, like Ivanka Trump was known as the first daughter in the first Trump presidency. Elon Musk is referred to in some quarters as the first buddy. So he's obviously, tried to link up with Mr. Trump, but to what extent that relationship will be sustained, and you can never predict the future in as far as Mr. Trump is concerned, and also in all these relationships, because he seeks to dominate every relationship that he enters into. And Elon Musk, as you know, is not somebody you can just walk over, just walk all over. So, but for the moment, I think Elon Musk has drawn a lot of advantage from this linkage with Mr. Trump. Now, he has significant business interests in China, as we all know, because Tesla is manufactured in China. But the Tesla cars manufactured in China are not recipients of Chinese subsidies, or so they will not attract that kind of attention and opposition from the U.S. trade authorities like other exports from China would. So in that sense, Mr. Musk is a little, sheltered from that kind of reaction or action by the U.S. authorities under Mr. Trump's tutelage. But this is interesting because, this is essentially the privatization of power that you are seeing here. Mr. Trump himself comes from the private sector. Mr. Musk, of course, is the richest man in the world, the richest businessman in the world. So and he is looking up, he and another entrepreneur, Mr. Vivek Ramaswamy, are looking after government efficiency. They are going to suggest ways and means to improve government efficiency. Of course, whatever proposals they submit will have to be approved, by the Office of Management and Budget as they have in the US system. So we'll have to see what changes, to what extent the changes will come. But Mr. Trump has come to power this time with literally a sledge and hammer, I think, when it comes to de-civilizing the civil service, literally, and getting rid of a lot of people who were traditionally part of the American system, the system within the Beltway in Washington, D.C. So there are changes obviously going to be executed. Everything will happen after January 20th. So we still have a few days to go. So there's a lot of speculation as to what will happen on this front. By and large, apart from Mr. Musk, the people he has chosen as members of his cabinet, I think the key force, for instance, Secretary of State, Senator Rubio, and then the National Security Advisor, the Treasury Secretary, the Commerce Secretary, they are all people of some standing, people who have experience, people who have some stature. So he's just not randomly picked them. The other appointments he's made, for instance, the defense secretary, former Fox News host who looks good on television. We'll have to see how whether the Senate will confirm his nomination. So one can expect some kind of action on that front once the nominations come up before the Senate of a number of his appointees. But yes, for now, Mr. Musk is very much in a good position where his relationship with Mr. Trump is concerned. Although I think he went around suggesting the name of another candidate for Treasury Secretary, somebody that Mr. Trump did not choose, and he went to town trying to propagate that candidature. So that could not have gone down very well with Mr. Trump. But as they say in American football, he's got 2 more strikes, 3 strikes and you're out. So we'll have to see what happens for the future.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. We'll now move towards geopolitics and the China question and the Indo-Pacific as well. Recently, the Indo-Pacific has become a central point of focus in US foreign policy. Some experts would obviously comment on that. How do you think a second Trump presidency will approach China's growing influence in the region? And how will that affect India's strategic positioning? I'll pose this to Dr. Chaulia.
Okay. I think the second Trump administration is at a different geopolitical moment than the first one. So 2016, 2017, they tried to sharpen the understanding of, China as an adversary for the first time. Until Obama, there was more of a what is called congagement, which is to counter but also to engage, and China. Now, I think under Trump 1.0, we saw a move towards at least intending to move in a direction to name China as the number one main challenger or the adversary. And that, in a way, was continued under Biden also, the last 4 years. So I think the entire US polity, Democrats, Republicans, all of them have grown more disillusioned and I would say also more clear-eyed about the long-term challenge that China poses to US power and influence and dominance in many critical regions of the world, especially the Indo-Pacific, but even beyond. And China has had a displacement effect on the US in Latin America, in Africa, especially in the developing world. The Chinese have just muscled in, and with the money power and through the Belt and Road and through financial means primarily, not so much militarily, they've been able to really to push the US aside and become the dominant player in many parts of the world. So there is a great power competition, and Trump will be aware of that. Although, like I said before, Trump, as an economic nationalist and a populist, does not care much for these, global balance of power or for to somehow save the liberal international order. In fact, Trump is the kind of populist I wrote about in one of my previous books called Trump: Emerging Powers in a Post-American World, that for him, the US should not be shouldering the burden of maintaining global order or maintaining global balance of power or keeping the world safe for democracy. He just doesn't believe in any of these liberal concepts, the ones that we saw under Obama and again under Biden. He just doesn't believe in those things. But there is a vast bureaucracy and a spread out state apparatus in the US. The elite consensus built over several decades since the end of the Cold War, since 1990s, is that the US should prevail in critical regions and should not allow adversaries to become dominant in East Asia, in the Middle East, or in Europe. So I think that there is going to be an internal tug of war between what we call the liberal internationalists, or what the Trump crowd calls the deep state, and the populists. You saw that it may be quite strong this time as well. There will be internal resistance to the idea that the US should not be trying to contain China in a big way. So I think you will find different factions, and it will be quite entertaining in the sense like the US is going to be the fault lines within the American polity will be exposed on foreign policy issues much more, because the consensus is kind of divided now into multiple factions. So how strongly the Indo-Pacific idea will go forward, and how strongly Trump administration will push back on China, it may be a mixed bag. The trade war will be quite severe, uh, but the coalition building may not be so strong like under Biden. So bilateral, I think generally Trump's preference is for bilateral because he thinks he can get a better deal for the US one on one, given the comparative advantage. If they're like seven partners or 10, four allies, five allies, and 6 or 7 strategic partners of the US in the Indo-Pacific altogether, uh, they have, for example, Indonesia is not an ally, it's a strategic partner. Vietnam is not an ally, it's a strategic partner. India is not an ally, it's a strategic partner. The US has also built strategic partnerships apart from its core alliance system. So how reliable the US will be for all these countries, allies and partners, remains to be seen. And Trump will give the jitters because he's prone to thinking that all these allies and partners, they take free rides on the US. So he will want them to shoulder most of the burden of managing the China problem in some ways. But there'll be others saying that the US should not give up its traditional role as the upkeeper of order in the Indo-Pacific. So it will be a debate, it will be a fight, and we'll see who prevails. But it also mean more chaos, because it's not going to be very, very organized and neat and well planned out. They're going to be open disagreements. Trump often is famous for openly challenging his own secretaries of state and defense secretary and national security advisors, whoever is the pick, on these matters. And of course, power is divided, like I said. It's not like the president will have the final say on each and everything. So we'll see. And each of these countries also, how they respond. So far we are talking about how Trump will deal with China, but how will China handle Trump? What will be their strategy, knowing all these the fragmentation of the US polity and the tussle between the populists and the internationalists. These are the things that are to be watched out for. And how will the allies and the partners respond to Trump? Will they go back to a kind of this transactional deal making on one-on-one basis? What happens to the coalitions and the alliances? Generally, the fear is that they will not be as strong as under the liberal internationals. Whenever Trump has been in power, there has been a kind of a sense of loss of credibility of US commitments. So I think everybody is going to look at, in fact, our external affairs minister, Dr. Jaishankar, has said it, that we are going to see more hedging in the world. And what he means by that is people will diversify, people will look for other partners, and people will look to not to put all the eggs in the US basket. That was also my argument in my book, Trump, which I wrote during his first term, which is that, because he is not willing to back you up fully, and because he's always asking you to pay up more as an ally or as a partner, you're actually forced to be on your own, and it actually lessens your sense of dependence or reliance on the US, which is good. We want India to shoulder the burden and be the net security provider, and to rise as the major or the number one power in Asia, or to be equal to China. So we will need to shoulder more burdens ourselves, and maybe expect less from the US about how far they'll go to push back China.
So I think there are a few points that maybe I could add to this. When Mr. Trump speaks about the 60% tariffs, or 100% in the case of EVs coming from China, I think perhaps this has not been sufficiently, in a sense, strategized in terms of what benefits it brings to the US consumer, because according to the conventional wisdom, the US consumer will end up paying much more for goods that come from China, because everything is passed on to the consumer. And, I don't know if China is going to bear the brunt of that. Of course, China is a trading nation, and it accounts for 30% of global manufacturing today. And there are a lot of countries within its trading connections and relationships. So China has many eggs in the basket. Let us put it that way, and the extent of the tanglement with the US over the years, the way businesses have functioned, the way trade has been deployed, the way investments have been made. I mean, it's very difficult decoupling. As somebody said, it took 46 years for China to reach this stage. It may take another 46 years for complete decoupling to take place, because that is the extent of the lattice work, let us put it, of connections between China and the United States. The second point is that domestic policy is the foundation of strength for every country. Foreign policy is obviously a reflection of that. And Mr. Trump has a lot to concentrate on what he needs to do within the United States. Take their shipbuilding capacity, for instance. It's in tatters, literally. They have to fix their defense industrial base if they have to make America great again. How are the cyber defenses functioning to protect critical infrastructure? And the Chinese, have their own, ways of making life difficult on that score. So, I think when Mr. Trump deploys his China policy, and there'll be a lot of hawks. There'll be hawks that want China to go down, that even talk of regime change. There are others who believe that the connections between China and the United States are so complex that you cannot change things overnight. Let us see which view prevails. But Mr. Trump, my own assessment of Mr. Trump is that there is a method always to his so-called madness. It's not like he's not behaving in a completely illogical way when he takes decisions on these big issues. And when he speaks about having no wars and peace with strength, I think, yes, the world will be anticipating that something good comes out of it. So there is a mix involved here. But in the Indo-Pacific, I think the US needs allies and partners. It needs allies and partners to have an effective China policy, or to counter the Chinese threat and make China pay for the cost of aggression in the South China Sea and other places. This is not saying there should be war and confrontation. And on Taiwan, I think he will be quite careful and move with due deliberation, because the Chinese are just waiting for red lines to be crossed. And although they are not saying that they will use they're not announcing a kind of deadline, for unifying Taiwan within the Chinese mainland. They haven't said that. They have, although people say by 2027, that's you should watch out. They haven't really announced it, but they are actually waiting. And things like the Pelosi visit to Taiwan a few years ago created such an adverse Chinese reaction. And I think there are lessons to be learned from that. And I'm sure Mr. Trump is aware of all this.
Thank you so much, Ambassador and Dr. Chaulia. Given that we have discussed that Trump does not like multilateral, would instead go on for direct interaction to get a better deal for the US. I would like to bring in Dr. Tourangbam here. Do you think Quad, which has now emerged as a very big alliance in the region, will it continue to have a bigger impact, or will it be diminished under Trump? And what are the alternatives that India can use as a forum to combat China?
Well, first of all, I'll just put it across this way that the Quad got revived in 2017 under Trump's first administration. So there's no point of what Quad, dismantling or discontinuing in the Trump 2.0, right? So I think, we have to watch out for what would be the re-emphasis and focus areas. Under the Biden administration, the Quad has become much more enlarged, not in terms of members, I'm saying in terms of issue areas, right? So if you look at the joint statements that have come out, you see a number of non-military issues which have taken much more focus during the Biden administration, including infrastructure and green infrastructure and the climate aspect also. So I think during the Trump administration, you might see a scaling down of the climate aspect to a large extent, right? And then a refocus more on the security and defense aspect of the Quad. And a much more, let's say, transactional or quid pro quo reciprocal approach of more burden sharing. We have to see what is that quid and pros that he's looking for, right, in terms of burden sharing. Um, and then following up to, I'll come back to this again, but following up to what Professor Chaulia has mentioned previously, I think, we need to sort of also, and I'll do a little bit of history mapping here, right, in the sense that there's an American historian called Doris Goodwin, right, and she wrote this book called Team of Rivals. And when Obama came in and then picked Hillary Clinton as the Secretary of State, that book became very popular. That somehow Obama administration was sort of building this team of rivals with, who had contrarian views to the president. That is not the case with Trump. So you are not going to have a team of rivals within the Trump administration. You're going to have more of a team of hardcore loyalists, right? How far that loyalty will go and how far those relationships will grow, and we have seen in the first administration. So we have to see. I think it's also a good time to reflect on the changes which are happening in the schools of U.S. foreign policy. Walter Russell Mead is credited with bringing out this four Jacksonians and Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians and Wilsonians, right? So in the Trump administration, the Jeffersonians and the Wilsonians take a big seat. And then what you see is more of a Jacksonian sort of approach to U.S. foreign policy with a concoction of the Hamiltonians, if you are looking at the economic side of the way Trump sees, he frames security threats in economic terms, right? So when he looks at Taiwan, he is seen saying like, we are an insurance company, right? You need to pay off if you need to pay the premium if you want the support from us. The way he talks about in Ukraine also. Right before when the election campaign was going on, because the Europeans and the transatlantic partners were the most concerned ones, the European Council on Foreign Relations came up with this paper, which is doing a lot of rounds now, which brings out these three tribes in the US foreign policy, which is going to fight for the eyes and ears of Trump. And they call themselves as primacists, privatizers, restrainers, a lot of them fitting actually into what Professor Chowli had mentioned earlier about the liberal international order guys. And I found something very interesting. Someone was talking about the fact that there's a murmur within Southeast Asia that we are going to see a shift from rules-based order to a deals-based order with a deal maker in the White House. So you're going to see all of this. I think we need to really look for what really happens in the near term to Biden's integrated deterrence concept and implementation in the Indo-Pacific, because Lloyd Austin did a lot of rounds of Asia during his term as the defense secretary, talking about integrated deterrence and how the US was now more comfortable from moving from a hub and spoke alliance to a more integrated deterrence concept and implementation, where the partners and the allies in Asia had, we're seeing a different sort of a phase in how America wields its power. I think, it's very important to understand that, on the one hand, you have the resources of power that America brings with it. And on the other hand, it's the American wielding of power and how that power is deployed and how other countries are responding to that deployment of power. I think that's a very interesting thing to look out for. And I think, for India, integrated deterrence brought in a little bit of that leeway wherein the Americans were now accepting the deployment of power in a more multipolar world, which is the acceptance and acknowledgement of more independent powers like India, that you can't function in the way that you had functioned for a very long time, where you had not gone so close to a country like India, which was not so dependent on you for its defense and security. So I think for the fact that in defense and security, India is not so dependent on the United States for its own defense and security, Trump might be much more comfortable in that sense with dealing with India, which he doesn't see as a free rider in that sense. So I think the overall scenario is sort of not gloomy for us, right? I think at the end, I would just put across this that one of the near-term consequences of Trump could be that there could be a change in the way Indo-Pacific regional countries look at defense spending. So you could see a change on regional defense spending, both in the European security environment as well as in the Indo-Pacific, like Japan and South Korea, how they are responding to it. So I think there's a lot to chew on here. We just have to be nimble-footed in terms of how we respond to how America deploys its power in the broader Indo-Pacific, and also how America handles our nearest neighborhood, which is South Asia, both in terms of a direct impact and also in terms of the unintended consequences for South Asia from Trump 2.0.
Thank you so much for that answer. So now I think we should move on to climate change. And we have a question for Ambassador Rao. So while we were talking about the nominations that Trump has made, in the context of his nomination to lead the NIH, he nominated Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who has previously called the COVID-19 pandemic one of the worst mistakes, and he has been an advocate for herd immunity instead of vaccination in the US. So in the context of potential global health concerns and pandemics, how does international cooperation with America change under Trump?
I think ultimately, the prospect of a future pandemic, God forbid that it should come, exposes the fact that this is really a world without borders. Even as you see the rise of nationalism and populism, and everybody is trying to enforce their own lines of separation, pandemics, in a sense, remind us ultimately of our common humanity. Even as we are up against things like artificial intelligence, who knows what the powers of artificial intelligence will be in the future. So in terms of, what Dr. Jay Bhattacharya has to say and how Mr. Trump reacts to issues like vaccination, the fact is also it was during the first Trump administration, Trump 1.0, that Operation Warp Speed led to the development of the mRNA, quick development of the mRNA vaccines, which then made such a difference to combating COVID-19. So the truth is it's never a black and white situation. I think when you're confronted with situations like what happened with COVID-19, I think people tend to rally around a single cause, the cause being that you have to get over this threat, you have to eliminate it, you have to allow people to survive, enable people to survive, and cut down on deaths and fatalities. So I don't think anybody has really imagined the scenario on this. Issues of herd immunity and vaccination. I think for the rest of the world, India included, I think vaccinations will continue to be important. And I think within our population, there is a widespread consensus that things like vaccinations are good for you. And there are no vaccine deniers, really. We don't have that kind of, ideology that circulates within our country, or for that matter, in the rest of Asia, I haven't come across. So Asia does stand out, as a bastion of good sense, common sense on these issues. And I think the Americans have a lot to learn. Even as, within the country, within America, there is so much of a debate and struggle, indeed, that goes on such issues between the vaccine deniers and between those. And there is this whole army of opposition now to Dr. Anthony Fauci as a result of this. And, he's been pilloried as somebody who caused so many deaths, when at the time of COVID, we all know he kind of led the way really on how to combat this illness. So on global health, Mr. Trump, of course, is not a multilateralist, and we can expect more opposition and more tensions in the US-WHO relationship. So that is definitely a given. But in terms of bilateral cooperation, and India and the US have a lot of cooperation in the field of health, and I don't think Mr. Trump will stand in the way of such cooperation. And indeed, it may continue to grow and be built up, and because there is a community of experts and scientists in both countries that already have developed extensive linkages. that will continue to operate, and that cannot change. So you're looking at a network of linkages between India and the United States built up over the last 2.5 decades, which is why the relationship is in a good place today, regardless of who comes to power, in the White House. And there is a bipartisan consensus about good relations with India. This is perhaps one of the few issues on which Americans on both sides of the political divide agree. So.
Thank you so much for that answer. So we have one last question in the context of climate change, and I'll open this to all of the panelists. With the rising urgency of climate change, how can India, who aims to be the voice of the global south in such negotiations, engage with the US and the West under the second Trump administration and push for a more ambitious climate policy, especially after we've seen that the COP29 this year failed?
Okay. I don't think there's going to be much to negotiate with the US on this matter. They're very hard line, on this question. The Trump is essentially a climate change denier, and he continues to believe in the drill baby drill ideology, which is to promote fossil fuels. So the US will again lag in terms of the combat against climate change. There's no doubt about it. The Europeans will be mighty upset about it. There's going to be a big gulf between the Europeans and the US on this matter, as we saw during the first Trump administration. And developing countries will also be outraged because the US will not contribute to this, even this paltry sum of $300 billion a year, which has been agreed upon at the most recent COP conference on climate, which is supposed to be for green transition from global north to global south. So we will actually be left scrambling again for resources. And what we will see, as it happened during Trump's time, is that within the US, individual mayors and cities and states will diverge from the federal government. The ones that are Democrat ruled will say we are facing a planetary extinction and we have to do something about climate change. The ones which are Republican will not. So you will find some municipal level, sub-unit level action on climate change from the US, which is relatively good news. But overall picture is the US contribution in terms of public finances, especially towards the green transition for the global south, will disappear. There's just no doubt about it. So in that context, what are our options? I mean, we need the resources to be able to make the transition, right? So I think there is a room for India to align with the EU, with Japan, and with other G7 member countries apart from the US, which have the wealth, to be able to find alternative mechanisms, if not to substitute for the US contribution, but at least to do some damage control and to keep the finances moving for the transitions to green and innovations. Even on these things, the US scientists and American institutions on environmental issues are still quite advanced. So we will align with all partners, including American institutions or maybe sub-unit level governments and private actors, who can help advance and alleviate the uh, our existential crisis with climate, right? So Trump will not at all be sympathetic. In fact, he's been saying that. I recall last time he was saying that if India is a developing country, the US is also a developing country. So he comes up with these kind of lines to argue that there should be no grounds given to global south in terms of these kind of assistance. So this whole foreign aid business and all, he doesn't like any of this, because he thinks that the US is just being milked and exploited by developing countries. So I think we have to look beyond the US actually on this matter. I don't foresee any groundbreaking new initiatives for to advance green technologies with the US. Although there are, like I said, there are some actors within the American polity or the society as a whole or the economy who we could still, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation will always continue to support India, whether it is Trump or Biden, right, or anyone else. Likewise, there are other entities with whom we will align. So I think, in a way, we'll want to wait out the Trump storm for 4 years before we go back to a kind of maybe a global coalition and global consensus on combating climate change. Until then, I'm afraid I don't foresee any good news.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chaulia. We'll now quickly move towards our last segment, which is on immigration, and I'll open up last question to everybody here. Since we have already discussed that Trump is a hardliner on immigration, and he perhaps will have a very strong line against not just illegal immigration, but also restricting of H-1B visas, which Indians, around 70% of H-1B visas are given to Indians. How will that impact the Indian diaspora in the US in the larger whole? And what are the policies that the government of India can perhaps choose to take in the near future? Ambassador.
Well, as I said earlier on immigration, it's a very hardline stance that you can expect from the second Trump administration. The Indian diaspora in the United States is a very significant group of people, very successful. But there are also among them newer migrants, and also I believe in the last couple of years there are also a few illegal immigrants who have come into the United States. So we don't know what their fate will be. Now, I think Mr. Trump is also opening up every issue as far as naturalization is concerned. Now, naturalization of foreigners as U.S. citizens, for instance, that has gone on. If you are born to foreign parents in the United States, you automatically acquire U.S. citizenship under the U.S. Constitution. But there are rumors afoot that even that is something he wants to reopen and perhaps change. So these are things that have been in force for over a century now. But everything is being reworked or reviewed, and so we really don't know what the future will hold for foreign people who have not been born in America, who have come to America as migrants, what the future holds for them. There's a whole question of separation of children from parents. He intends obviously to remove the whole Dreamers facilities that President Obama had introduced for certain groups of migrants. And when it comes to technology and the entry of skilled personnel from India into the United States, as you mentioned, the largest proportion of H-1B visas in the United States is given to Indian techies and Indian professionals. So what happens as far as that is concerned? But it seems to be, to my mind, a very self-defeating policy, because the United States needs skilled professionals. Its strengths have been built on the fact that it has been open to the entry of the best talent from all over the world, which comes together and consolidates the American dream, as it were. So if that is going to be disbanded and is not going to operate on the lines of the structures we saw before, I think then this whole immigration policy of Mr. Trump is bound to generate a lot of chaos. I think we didn't, I know that this is the last segment, but I'd just like to also mention that we haven't mentioned Europe in our discussion today. And I think the Europeans, particularly the other members of the G7, are particularly apprehensive of what might happen under a Trump administration, whether it's on Russia, Ukraine, whether it's on the whole network of the transatlantic alliances that were built up after World War II. So this is a segment also, I think, that is going to be part of this tectonic shift that people talk of when it comes to the second Trump presidency.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Interestingly, we will be hopefully having another discussion soon on that aspect entirely. Since we don't have that much time left, we'll move on to closing remarks. I think in the order of perhaps Dr. Tourangbam can speak first, then Dr. Chaulia, and then Ambassador Rao. Dr. Tourangbam, you have the floor.
Thank you. I mean, in terms of closing remarks, Um, we stand at a very interesting point in American domestic politics, and also, um, you know, this linkage between domestic fractures and how it replicates in America's global leadership and how other countries respond to the deployment of American power. And I think it's the right time, or it's a very opportune time for people like us who are studying American politics from India to not to go beyond studying the bilateral and try to understand America as such and what are the well springs and the sources of American power and American foreign policy that we are in a better, uh, you know, conditions sort of then to respond to American the disruptions in American foreign policy. And I think it's a very interesting time where a personality like Trump is almost seen as a dark knight, who could sort of lead America to a better future. I think we have to wait and watch and see how strong Trumpism is and how lasting it is going to be on American domestic politics and America's engagement with the wider world.
Yeah, I think we are in for a very radical second term of Donald Trump. I think he will be more unrestrained than he was in his first term. But like I said, there will be continued internal tug of war among different elements of the American state and the apparatus. So you may not find America being very focused on world affairs in a very systematic with a grand strategy. There will be a new national security strategy issued by the second Trump administration, as is the norm. But I don't think that they will necessarily pursue it, because the history shows that the grand strategies are more on paper when it comes to Trump, because he has a lot of contradictions and he brings a lot of contradictory forces to the table. So I think US India strategic partnership, my new book, Friends, is all about our closest strategic partners. It will continue. The US partnership will continue to flourish. If you do look at the overall picture, although we spoke about a lot of the points of friction that are likely to emerge, and it is in our best interest to have one of the two existing great powers on our side, so that we can continue to grow without major obstructions to India's rise. So, in my view, we will have to swallow some insults and humiliations, and at the same time, manage the Trump phenomenon to our best interests. We did a reasonably good job from 2017 to 2020, and I'm pretty sure that with Prime Minister Modi's personal chemistry and bromance, some of the rougher edges that Trump brings can be smoothed, and we'll maintain the relationship. As to the US, whether it can sustain its role as a global leader and all, I very much doubt so. And in fact, the previous book I wrote was about emerging powers in a post-American world. And I believe that under Trump, a post-American world will emerge in a more assertive manner, simply because the US is not willing to share global burdens anymore, at least for the next 4 years. Thank you.
I think we will have to be even firmer in the defense of our strategic autonomy in a second Trump presidency, because here you have an American president who seeks to question old attitudes and old approaches, and seeks to impose American power on locations around the world. So our free and independent and energetic foreign policy will certainly be put to test, and we should be prepared to gird ourselves for that. I said the other day that with Trump, the position you have to take constantly is brace, brace, brace. I think you have to be, aware of that. Essentially, this is a world between orders, even for us in the Indo-Pacific. In a sense, the end of history. I think Fukuyama's book, written 30 years ago, perhaps should have been written now. And America is redefining itself in many ways. It's questioning all given truths, whether it comes to their constitution, whether it comes to the management of diversity within America. Diversity particularly is a loaded term today in the US. And the whole definition of American democracy and checks and balances, how they are going to operate, we will have to see. Mr. Trump, in many ways, seeks to rewrite history. We'll have to see whether he will be successful in that regard, and whether, if he is successful, whether it'll be to the good of the rest of the world and to the good of the American people. I think we are very much at the crossroads. We are at an inflection point, and the destinies of 7 billion people across the planet are involved in this, because what America does doesn't stay within America.
Thank you so much for these wonderful remarks, all of us. Would you give me 7 more minutes? Because we really wanted to have an audience live discussion, and 7 more minutes would do it. Is that all right with all of you? Thank you so much. People who wish to raise a question by opening their mics, please raise the hand, and we'll use one question from the Q&A box that people have answered. All right. So, Cynthia, please go ahead.
Thank you for such an enlightening session. I mean, there are so many things that I learned from this, to all of the panelists. So an insightful point that I could gather from today's discussion was that with the coming up of Trump, there will be a greater emphasis on China plus one policy with the domestic American industries. And China itself will look for compensatory actions, as Ambassador Rao had also pointed out, the LAC disengagement and the coming up of China and Brazil axis. So what exactly will it have, and to what extent can we say that South Asian nations can now, look for a greater global supply chain, participation, and how will it impact their role in the global trade?
Okay, let me just quickly answer that. Trump is not likely to favor what is called friendshoring. This is a Biden administration term promoted by Janet Yellen, the Biden administration's Treasury Secretary, which means that they encourage American investors to reduce their stakes in China, if not fully pack up and leave, and instead go to friendly countries of the US, allies and strategic partners. I think Trump, being a core economic nationalist, believes in onshoring, which is to basically return manufacturing to the US. And he uses the tariff threats and the trade wars in order to compel American investors to come back home and to manufacture in the US. I think that he will again attempt that. And so we cannot be so sanguine about this China plus one strategy helping to reroute capital into India. We've had a bit of a crisis with the inward FDI over the last 1 year, and we are hoping for a rebound in 2024-25. And we deserve at least $100 billion or more of inward investment per year, given the size and the ambitions of our Make in India projects. So I think expecting Trump to help us steer American businesses into India may be, I think, a bit far-fetched. But these are not necessarily, unlike China, Trump cannot compel American companies to go wherever he wants them to, so it's a free market capitalist society. So we will have to do our homework, and if our domestic reforms and our regulatory systems are more inviting, we can expect more US capital to come in. So it's not so much about whether Trump will be the deciding factor. It's about what we can do to improve our ease of doing business and our climate to invest foreign capital.
Thank you so much. Abhinav, you can go ahead with your question.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for selecting me to ask this question. I want to ask specifically related to Trump's policy in East Asia again. So under the Trump administration, there were 3 major summits that he had with North Korea, in Hanoi, in Singapore, and one that took place at the DMZ itself. I want to ask that, do you think Trump will try to make peace with North Korea again in the second term? As in, how much of a priority would that be for him?
Well, I think the moment, his North Korea moment, as it were, Mr. Trump's, passed with his first presidency. I don't know to what extent he's going to reopen that front. And meanwhile, I think between North Korea and South Korea, relations have deteriorated to such an extent that, as far as the North Koreans are concerned, they're not even talking of reunification now. They see themselves as two separate entities. And you have the Russia, North Korea, China, Iran sort of agglomeration developing, which speaks of these divides in global affairs that we are going to be witness to during the Trump years. And how Trump is going to navigate, for instance, his Iran policy, we'll have to see, because he is an all and out supporter of Israel, even much more than Biden. And the Israel-Iran balance today has certainly been reworked, and to what extent that affects the outcomes in the Middle East will also be a factor to be taken into consideration. So all in all, I believe that no old definitions will apply anymore. And as I mentioned earlier, where South Korea is concerned, Trump doesn't regard South Korea as one of his. He doesn't have a soft spot for South Korea. Now, sometimes he tends to act in a very unpredictable way. But even then, I don't believe on North Korea he will be able to really, do those love letters to Kim. That approach will not operate this time. So you're looking at a situation in East Asia, in Northeast Asia, that is going to be quite sensitive and in a way unpredictable, given the North Korean regime's behavior patterns.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. With that, I think we should go ahead with the last moment with the vote of thanks. I invite Medha Gupta, who is the head of our speaker series, to present the VOT.
I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, you are.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the organizing team, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to our distinguished panelists, Ambassador Nirupama Rao, Professor Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, and Dr. Monish Tourangbam for their presence with us and sharing their invaluable perspectives on such an interesting topic. Their wealth of knowledge and profound experience have truly enriched our understanding on how relations between India and US will churn with US President Donald Trump back in the office. This event would not have been possible without the profound contribution of division heads, members in the founding committee of the Indian Foreign Policy Project. A special thanks to B.R. Neeraj, Ajitesh Vishwanath, and Manini Agarwal. Lastly, we would like to thank the audience for their active participation and thoughtful engagement throughout the session. As we go towards the conclusion of the event, we hope to carry forward the spirit of dialogue and cooperation that lies at the heart of diplomacy. Let's continue to think critically about India's way in the world and grow our shared passion for international relations and diplomacy through more such sessions in the future. Thank you all.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for
Thank
being
you.
here, everyone. We'll see you in the
Good
next
night.
session.
Thank you.